now will you pray with me? Holy and gracious God, we ask your blessing upon this service, upon this day. Move in this moment and help us to hear your word. Move among us, that these words might not be my words, but your words. That all of us, pastor included, might hear your message for us this day. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. This morning, in our lesson from 2 Samuel, we remember the birth of a nation. A new nation, for all intents, built upon the idea that God was with them and seeking to walk in the ways of God. A new nation that is the Davidic monarchy of Israel, because this is the text that makes David king. It is the moment in the collective memory of ancient Israel where it all begins to go right. It's the beginning of the Davidic monarchy. It's not the beginning of David's story. This is, after all, 2 Samuel, and we've already followed David through much of 1 Samuel. Through his anointing by the prophet Samuel, his battle with Goliath, his serving and then hiding from King Saul, and even the death of Saul and his best friend Jonathan. Israel, too, by this moment in time, has been through the ringer. Saul's reign at the end was somewhat unstable, and even after Saul's death, a civil war broke out for 7 years and 6 months, with most of the country actually supporting Saul's son, because after all, in monarchies, sons follow their fathers as king, not this new upstart from Judah, but Judah following David, and a civil war for 7 years 6 months. But this moment, this chapter is where it all ends. In a covenant moment, in a moment of negotiated peace, in a God-ordained moment, at least according to text. All the trouble, all the strife, all the prelude to King David comes to a close, and the monarchy begins. Jerusalem is quickly captured, the city of David. With a new capital, a new king takes the throne. It is the moment that creates a nation, that founds a nation, that makes it whole. It's a moment whose significance in the collective memory of ancient Israel cannot be overstated. Because on that day, in many ways, the nation was birthed. A ruler blessed by God, a ruler after God's own heart, was now in charge. And a glorious golden age in Israelite history would begin. It wouldn't last very long, but it would begin. Because David was that ruler who walked in the ways of God. Which makes me wonder a little bit this morning, what exactly makes a ruler in the eyes of God? How does one be one blessed by God? What makes a king? What makes a nation? It feels like a question worth asking, and it's one that those who come to crown David, those from the other tribes who aren't Judah, have a clear answer to. What makes a king? Being a shepherd. Caring for the flock, the sheep, caring for the people of the nation, especially those least able to care for themselves. David is lauded by the other tribes as being one who, even during the time of King Saul, was caring for others. Though Saul was king, they say, you were already leading, caring for Israel. We might see this as an after-the-fact compliment in an attempt to win over their new monarch. After all, they were just fighting against David a little before this, which is true. And it's also plausible that they're saying this because they just, in the chapter previous, saw David deal harshly with the man who assassinated his rival for power, who killed Saul's last son. Also true. But it's a criteria they list, and it's very clear. To be a king, one must be able and willing to care for the people, for all the people, even if it does nothing for you politically, even if it helps a rival, even if you'll get no credit for it, because it is the caring for others, especially those who are least able to care for themselves, that matters, that makes a person a right choice to be king. And in case you're wondering, the prophets in later texts second this criteria. They say that to be a king, to be a nation right in the eyes of God, is indeed to care for others, to care for the most vulnerable, the poor, the downtrodden, the widows and orphans. A king, by the words of these other tribes of Israel and by the prophets after them, a nation should have a shepherd's mindset, willing to risk their life for the sake of the sheep, willing to do all they can to keep the sheep safe, to keep them nourished, to keep them cared for. That's what it means to be a ruler, a king. The people of Israel see this in David, and because of this, they are willing to begin the Davidic monarchy. The line of David will unite Israel for at least 100 years. They enter into covenant with David and make him their king. And the new nation is born. But y'all know, because you don't live under a rock, that on this particular day, we're not just celebrating the birth of the new nation of Davidic Israel, are we? This is July 4th. This is the day we celebrate our nation. On this day, we remember a moment in our collective memory that brought this nation into being. On this day, we even often remember our self-suggested idea that we're a nation that wants to live up to God's ideals for us. And so it's interesting to hold this reality of calendar with this text from lectionary together. I don't often preach on national holidays because we don't live by a calendar, we live by our God. But the two together today might speak something to us. This text, coming on this particular day, seems to me to have clear implications for us as a people and as a nation. Especially if we say we walk with God. Now, let me offer a caveat, as I think is important. There is always a danger when comparing oneself as a person or a community to people in the biblical story. Especially if the ones we're comparing ourselves to are the characters, nations, people that we're groomed to like in the story. So let's be clear what I'm about to say and not about to say. I'm drawing comparisons between ourselves and Israel because I think they're helpful. I am not saying we're a new Israel. I'm not saying that we're the only nation who has any of these callings. I do think we have a role to play in the world and work that God gives us to do as a nation. But other nations do too. Having offered that caveat, the implications of this text for us seem clear to me. If we are to be a nation that seeks after God, and we say that we are, our money says that we are, we are to be a nation that strives to be ruled and to make our rules united the ways of God, then we, much like David before us, must seek to care for all the people. Seek to care for the least of these. Our rulers should take after David the king, and not his war-making ways. It is not, in the text anyway, David's battle with Goliath or his prowess on the field that makes him king. He's made a king because the people saw in him a man who would care for others, who put the needs of the nation, of his people, of the flock, above his own power or claim or need for the throne. David is made a king because he was first a shepherd. And if we are to be a nation that is right in the eyes of God, we should expect no less from our national and political leaders. I understand that to suggest that our politicians should put the needs of the least of these in society, of those who don't vote in society, of those who need the most help in society above their own needs, could be seen as nonsensical. It's not the way our system works often, even at its best. But that's what it means to be a leader in the ways of God, to be a ruler following after the ways of God. To rule, to lead in the ways of God is to rule and lead like a shepherd who looks after the flock, who leaves the 99 to seek the one, who leads the flock in paths of righteousness by clear waters and pastures of green, even through the valley of the shadow of death. That is the way that King David began with. He didn't stay there. His later texts, which we're going to read this summer, get a little more messy. But it's where he began. It's who he was when made a king. It is the way proclaimed by the prophets. It is the way shown by Jesus. And if we would follow the ways of Jesus, we would be a nation that calls itself God ordained. We should push to be our own ways as well, even on this 4th of July. For that's what it means to be a nation in the eyes of God. Now, one last caveat. We who don't seek after political power are not left off the hook. Because this call does not just fall on our rulers, our leaders. It doesn't even just fall on how we choose our leaders. We don't get once every 2 to 4 years to think about shepherding, and that's it, and we vote. The text this morning is focused on David because it is the establishment of his as king, the first good king of Israel. But the prophets make it clear that this call belongs to the whole nation. It belongs to all who would follow the ways of God. That's why Jesus taught it. That's why Jesus lived it. Because it now belongs to us. We may not be the ones called to lead our nations. And for that, for me, I say, thank God. Oh my goodness, if I was called to that, I would pull my hair out. But we are among the ones tasked with the same shepherding, the same care. We can and indeed should and indeed are called to by Jesus. Care for the least of these. Seek after ways to help the downtrodden. Work for justice for the marginalized. And be like the shepherds of Israel, caring for all of God's people, caring for all of our fellow children of God, caring for the flock, for each other, for ourselves, for all around the world. We may or may not be able to change that whole world, or even our whole nation. But if we keep at it, if we work together with our fellow God followers around this nation and around the world, well, things things sometimes do eventually change. They have in the past, even our own past. Just ask the political minority that was the abolitionist movement. And they will in the future by the grace of God. But even when they don't, even when our work doesn't seem to make any big difference, our call, our task on behalf of God's kingdom is still clear. Care for the least of these. Care for all. Be shepherds in the eyes of God. So on this day, I'd like to hope the kids go out and celebrate. Have your barbecue, go camping, wave the flags. The fireworks are Thursday, but I'm going to watch it on TV tonight. Celebrate this new nation, conceived in liberty and born with the idea that they can walk in God's ways, even on this earth. That nation being Israel, of course, but also us. But as you do so, remember our national call, our individual call, our call from God to care for others, to be the shepherds God needs for all the flock, all of God's people. And then go and do likewise.